Okay, I think we'll get started now. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Susan Szymborski-Welsh. I'm the Communications Officer with the Woodland Carbon Code. On behalf of the Peatland Code team and the Woodland Carbon Code team, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining our webinar today. Our presenter, Rochelle Kennedy, who is the Biodiversity Crediting Project Manager at the IUCN UK Peatland Programme, will provide an update of our biodiversity crediting project. This will include what's been achieved up to date so far, as well as a look forward at the next steps. After Rochelle's presentation, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So if you do have any questions as we go along, please just pop them in the chat feature and we'll come to them at the end of the session. Our colleagues Renee and Natalie will be helping to manage the question session. I should also highlight that we're recording today's session for anyone who's unable to attend, and we'll make that available after through our website, so you can keep a lookout through our communications channels for that. I think that's all from me for now, so I'll hand straight over to Rochelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. So hi everyone, my name's Rochelle. As Susan mentioned, I'm the Biodiversity Crediting Project Manager at IUCN UK Peatland Programme. And I'm going to give you an update on the biodiversity crediting project that we've been working on to look at how we can incorporate biodiversity credits into our current carbon credit systems. So this is a project that's been a collaborative project between the Peatland Code and the Woodland Carbon Code. And it's also been funded through the Facility for Investment Ready Nature in Scotland, or FERNS, which is delivered by Nature Scot and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So just to give you an overview of what I will be talking about today, so I'm just going to start off with a little introduction to the Peatland Code and Woodland Carbon Codes, for those of you who aren't familiar with them. And then we'll have a little look at how we can integrate biodiversity into the carbon credit. And then we'll go on to looking at the use of reference sites to measure biodiversity change, and different options for adjusting a biodiversity metric to better suit the UK context. And then finally, we will finish off by looking at some financial modelling that we've done to try and understand how feasible this biodiversity credit is, how financially feasible it is. And then we'll finish off by just looking at the next steps that the project will be taking. So to start off, just a quick introduction to the Peatland Code and Woodland Carbon Code. So around 80% of peatland in the UK is in a damaged state, unfortunately. And there is a public funding commitment gap to restore these peatlands. On top of that, we have very ambitious tree planting targets in the UK. So almost 1 million hectares of tree planting was meant to happen by 2025. Many of these targets have been missed due to lack of funding. And the draft of Scotland's climate change plan actually acknowledges that the public sector funding alone will not be able to help to reach climate targets. So it's going to need a combination of both public and private sector finance to reach these targets. So this is where the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code come in. So they aim to close these funding gaps through the generation of carbon credits. So the way that it works is that woodland creation and peatland restoration projects register with the codes, and then they go through various verification and validation stages throughout the duration of their project. And at each stage of verification and validation, carbon credits can be released, which then generates more funding for more woodland creation or more peatland restoration. So these are high integrity units that can be used to compensate for unavoidable emissions. And just to say that we cater to the voluntary market, so these credits can't be used for mandatory carbon offsets. The codes are always informed by the latest scientific data and best practice. And also just to highlight that the codes are the only government-backed domestic voluntary carbon market standard. So at the moment, the carbon codes don't actually require any measurement of biodiversity uplift. They're very much focused on surveys that evidence the sequestration of carbon on the project site. However, they do assume that there is some kind of implicit benefit to biodiversity of woodland creation or peatland restoration. And so if we could demonstrate that projects are actually having a real measurable outcome for nature and biodiversity, we think that this could actually fetch a higher market price. So the combination of carbon benefits and measured biodiversity benefits could potentially sell for a greater price, which could generate more private finance for nature restoration. And then another point just to add to that is that if we can encourage greater biodiversity uplift on project sites by getting them to measure biodiversity change, this could actually lead to higher quality projects where planning for biodiversity is included from the outset of the project. So there's a number of different ways in which you can combine carbon credits with other types of credits like biodiversity credits or ecosystem restoration credits. A previous part of the project looked at all of these different types of credits. You've got things like bundles and stacked credits. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I just wanted to highlight that stacked credits were largely ruled out because they're quite risky at the moment. And so we're looking at moving from what we call an implicit bundle, which is what we have at the moment, where biodiversity is implicit within the carbon credit. So we're looking at moving from this to what we call an explicit bundle. So this is where biodiversity would be measured, and then a certain percentage uplift of biodiversity would be attached to each carbon credit and sold with the carbon credit. So you couldn't sell the biodiversity credits separately from the carbon credit, which is what you can do when you stack credits. We are also looking at offering a biodiversity only credit for peatland projects that don't qualify for carbon credits. So this is for shallow peats specifically. So they would have a biodiversity only credit. So how do you actually go about measuring this biodiversity change? So there are lots of different methods out there for measuring biodiversity change and translating these into credits. A previous part of the project looked at all of these different methods and highlighted that the method proposed by the Wallacea Trust would be most suitable for the codes because this is both nationally and internationally recognised as a robust method for measuring biodiversity change on project sites, and then translating those positive changes into awardable biodiversity credits. So the way that the Wallacea Trust method works is by using what we call a basket of metrics. So this is where multiple different things are measured. So we first of all would measure at least 4 taxonomic groups. So for peatlands and woodlands, this would be things like plants, birds, and invertebrates. And then for woodlands, we could also consider bats. And then in addition to these 4 taxonomic groups, we would measure a structural metric. So this just means some kind of measure of the habitat structure. So for example, for woodland, we're looking at using the Woodland Ecological Condition Score, which is based on 15 different indicators. For example, things like the vertical structure of the woodland and volume of deadwood and things like that. And then for peatlands, we're looking at using Richard Lindsay's Peatland Condition Score. which looks at the topography of the peatland. So you can see that these structural metrics really look at the structure of the habitat. So the taxonomic groups and the structural metric get combined into a score, and then we take an average score across these different metrics. And then when this has been calculated at the project baseline, so like this is before woodland creation or peatland restoration, and then every 5 or 10 years after that, from that score, we can calculate a percentage change in biodiversity and then attach that to the carbon credit. So one thing to highlight with the Wallacea Trust method is that they recommend using reference sites to set the target for restoration. So a reference site would be something like an intact peatland or woodland, preferably in a near natural condition, or else a peatland or woodland that has been previously restored, that is in a good condition. Now, obviously, this can be quite difficult to find in the UK since most habitat is degraded. And also, if we're asking projects to carry out biodiversity surveys on the project site and also on a reference site, then that's going to double the cost of surveys. So to address this challenge, we wanted to look and see if we could aggregate biodiversity data that has already been collected in intact peatlands and woodlands across the UK, and then have this available as sort of like a reference site database that projects can use as their reference data. So then that would avoid the costs of surveys and the difficulty in actually finding a reference site. So projects would only then have to pay for surveys on their own project site and not on the reference site. So we carried out quite an extensive search of publicly available literature, different databases and also reports to see what we could find. We limited the search to taxonomic groups that are suitable for woodland and peatland monitoring. So I mentioned earlier, we're specifically looking at plants, invertebrates, birds and bats. We did have additional criteria that the methods used to collect this data had to be reproducible. Like we really needed to know the survey effort that had been used and what kinds of equipment had been used to collect the data. And then we also limited the data to data that has been recorded in the last 15 years, so it's keeping it fairly recent. So we ended up obtaining data from peer-reviewed literature, the NBN Atlas, site condition monitoring reports, and then also things like the long-term monitoring network. And there was also some data from RSPB nature reserves as well. So just to give you an idea of the different taxonomic groups and the coverage that we were able to get with this database. So this is for woodland and peatland combined for now. So you can see that we had fairly good coverage of vegetation data, and then some somewhat patchy bird and arthropod or invertebrate data across the UK, but there was still quite a lot of data available publicly. And then if we look at how this looks for woodlands and peatlands kind of separated, so this map on the left here shows the woodland data, and then on the right, map B shows the peatland data. So you can see, obviously, we're able to find a lot more biodiversity data in intact woodlands in the UK compared to peatlands, where this is unsurprising, I guess, because there is so much degraded peatland in the UK that really most of the data was restricted to the flows area. We did have to filter some of this data down compared to what we initially had. So we did find that some peer-reviewed studies, although they'd looked at things like ancient woodland or near natural peatlands, actually when we looked at the sites, they weren't necessarily in a particularly good condition. So we had to use a variety of different approaches to filter this down. For peatlands, we ended up getting an expert opinion for the list of sites that we had data for. So we have been able to identify gaps in the database, but it seems to be quite a good start. And also it is possible that we can add to this database as more data becomes available, or as projects start to survey intact habitat, then they could potentially add that to the database. So another aspect of the Wallacea Trust method that we've been looking at is how the biodiversity uplift is actually calculated. So at the moment, the method uses a weighting of species by conservation status. So for example, using the IUCN conservation status, species that are considered critically endangered, for example, would get a higher weighting, and species that are considered least concern would get the lowest possible weighting. And so this is obviously to prioritise species that are more endangered. However, there are a couple of issues with following this approach in the UK. Firstly, for invertebrates, which we're quite interested in monitoring for the codes, many groups of inverts actually haven't been assessed for their conservation status, which means that we just wouldn't be able to weight invertebrates by conservation value. And then also weighting by conservation status may not actually prioritise peatland and woodland specific wildlife. So, for example, with peatlands especially, actually the number of species in an intact peatland is relatively low compared to other habitat types, but that doesn't mean that that wildlife doesn't have a value. It's actually, you know, very specific to that habitat, and it has a high value, but yeah, we need to think about ways of trying to prioritise peatland and woodland specific wildlife. So one of the ways that we were looking at was, instead of weighting species by conservation value, was using some kind of similarity index to measure change in communities from the project site towards the reference site, which is in a near natural or good condition. So using these similarity indexes, species that are present, so the species present as well as their abundances are taken into account. And so this could help to measure how close a project is to achieving a reference date. So as we move along the lifespan of the project, we would hope that there becomes more overlap between the communities, and that will be translated into like a percentage similarity. So we'll be aiming to get as close to 100% similar as possible. So this could be a good way of prioritising that peatland or woodland specific wildlife. Obviously, one limitation of using this is that it does rely on a reference site being available. So we have also thought up an alternative for projects that are unable to find a reference site, or where there's no reference site data available in the database. So the Wallacea Trust do propose a method for calculating biodiversity uplift that doesn't use a reference site, and it's just based on the project baseline. So we were looking at whether we could, instead of weighting species by conservation value, whether we could actually weight them by specialist species, and using habitat associations of each species. So in this case, when I say specialist species, I mean for peatlands, a specialist peatland species would be a species that is only found in bog and not in any other habitat types. So we know that both intact peatlands and mature woodlands are known to host more of these specialist species than more degraded habitat or much younger woodlands. So this means that this method could prioritise peatland and woodland specific biodiversity. And we do know a lot more about species associations with different habitat types than we do conservation score. So even for groups of invertebrates that haven't been assessed for their conservation status, we often have different traits databases that we could use to assign species to specialist species or species that are just not even associated with peatland or woodland. So yeah, that's the potential alternative for projects that are unable to have a reference site. Oh yeah, just to highlight that there is a limitation with this method as well, as always. So this would give a more conservative estimate than if we did the same thing using reference sites. So you wouldn't be able to obtain such a high biodiversity uplift than if you used a reference site. So we've seen the database that we've looked at for reference sites and some potential adjustments that we'd like to make to the Wallacea Trust method for measuring biodiversity change. Now we're going to have a look at the financial modelling component of this project. So we were really interested to see what the financial implications would be for projects if they were to go and measure biodiversity and then attach that to their carbon credits. So we did some financial modelling, which was carried out by Ricardo, to look at the difference in the break-even cost of the carbon-only credit, which is what we're offering at the moment, and a carbon plus or carbon plus biodiversity credit, which is what we would like to do. So Ricardo looked at various different scenarios and looked at all the different costs of peatland restoration and woodland creation. And so I'm going to show you these are preliminary findings. I have to highlight this because the financial models are still being finalised as we speak. But the final report on this will be available on our websites within the next week or so. So you'll be able to get like the details of it and final findings then. But I think so far we've seen that actually there's not a huge difference in the break-even price between a carbon only credit and a carbon plus biodiversity credit, which is a nice surprise because the survey costs do come across as being quite high. But actually, when you look at the difference between the two credit types, it isn't huge. Obviously, it does depend on the different scenarios that Ricardo looked at. So just to give you an idea of the range of these differences, for peatlands, the difference in the break-even point between the two credit types was as low as about £2, but then sometimes increasing up to almost £20 between the two credit types. And then for woodlands, the range was a little bit wider, and that difference in break-even price was a little bit higher as well, but still perfectly reasonable. So that was quite encouraging to see. Something that we weren't able to account for in the financial modelling was the potential reduction in biodiversity costs in the future. So we expect that moving forwards with the advancement in automated survey techniques that can potentially bring the cost of biodiversity surveys down, which would then reduce that break-even point. And then we also weren't really able to account for the potential increase in the value of a carbon credit or a biodiversity credit in the future. So we assume that as we get closer to 2050 and those targets that need to be reached, that the value of a carbon or biodiversity credit would increase dramatically, but we just don't know this, so we weren't able to factor that in as well. And then something interesting that came out of this as well was I think we were quite keen to know whether buyers and investors were willing to pay more for credits that could demonstrate a clear biodiversity uplift. But actually, it seems that there's not a huge amount of information out there on the price that these carbon plus credits could fetch. So we're quite keen to do some investor engagement in the next part of the project, or like some kind of willingness to pay study to try and answer this question. So also just to highlight that Ricardo did produce a financial modelling tool for us. So this will be available on the Peatland Code and Woodland Carbon Code websites. So it's a tool to help with decision making for projects, so aimed at projects that are doing peatland restoration or woodland creation. And you can see, looking at this screenshot on the right here, projects will be able to input their various different costs related to restoration or biodiversity surveys. And then the tool will give you your break-even point. So we hope that this will be a useful tool that projects will be able to use moving forwards. So I think the main things that we have learned from this project is that the use of reference sites is feasible in some parts of the UK. It's potentially more feasible for woodland than it is for peatland. We were able to gather a fair amount of biodiversity data across the UK. And although there were gaps in the data sets, these could gradually be filled as more biodiversity data becomes available, either through the published literature or through projects surveying their own reference site and then adding their data to the database. So that in the future could reduce those overall survey costs and the need to survey a reference site. We also explored these two different methods of measuring biodiversity change. So one using a similarity index, and then the other using weighting of species by specialism rather than conservation value. So we think either of these options would be feasible for the codes. And ultimately, I think the decision on which one is used going forwards will come down to feedback from projects, how feasible it is for projects to use reference sites, and then feedback from our executive boards and advisory boards as well. And then with the financial modelling, we found that this carbon plus biodiversity credit actually had quite a reasonable break-even point compared to the carbon only credit under most scenarios, which is quite encouraging, especially since survey costs are likely to reduce in the future. But also, you know, the value of a carbon or a biodiversity credit will also hopefully increase in the future. And we also, so Ricardo also produced this tool for projects to help them calculate that break-even point. And then I think the final, point that we learned was that we actually don't know at the moment how much buyers would be willing to pay for this carbon plus biodiversity credit, but we hope to know that in the not too distant future if we can secure some more funding to have a look at that in more detail. So on that note, there are a few next steps that we need to take before we can launch the Carbon Plus credit. So at the moment we have some draft methodology documents that were produced during the last part of the project that are available on the Peatland Code and Woodland Carbon Code websites. So we will be updating these fairly soon, just to reflect on what we've learned from this part of the project. We're also really keen to hear from any woodland creation or peatland restoration projects that would be keen to pilot the method this summer. So please do get in touch with us if you're interested in doing this. There are a couple of email addresses on the final slide for you to get in touch. I know that some of you have been in touch already with the Woodland Carbon Code, so we hope to get back to you quite soon on how that would all work once we've heard back on whether or how much funding we can secure for this next year. We're also wanting to look at our proposed metric with the 4 different taxonomic groups and the structural metric is obviously quite a survey intensive and detailed metric, especially since the structural metric is composed of like quite a few different indicators. So we'd be quite interested to have a look and see whether we actually need all of these different components or whether we could reduce the metric a little bit to help reduce survey costs. So that's something that we would like to do in the next part of the project. And then we will be putting our sort of adapted Wallacea Trust method through peer review, potentially through the BFI, which is the Biodiversity Futures Initiative. So they peer review the metric using like a panel of academics. So there's potential for the metric to change a little bit in response to feedback from them as well. As I mentioned, with the financial modelling, we are quite keen to do some investor engagement or a willingness to pay study. So that's something that we really hope to be able to get funding for in the next part of the project, just to provide some reassurance that you know, buyers are willing to pay extra for this additional biodiversity element. And then finally, there's just a few small things that we need to do just to refine the integration of biodiversity, or the biodiversity element, with the Woodland Carbon Code and peatland code frameworks. So yeah, a few extra things to do, but hopefully we have applied for more funding, so we're quite hopeful that we'll get at least some of it to try and continue this project and get it a little bit closer to launch. Okay, thanks everyone for listening. So if you are interested in piloting the method this summer, please do get in touch. So there's a couple of email addresses here. So if it's a peatland project, you can get in touch with the peatland code, or for a woodland projects, you can get in touch with the Woodland Carbon Code. And just to acknowledge again that the project was supported by the Facility for Investment Ready Nature in Scotland Ferns Fund, delivered by Nature Scot in collaboration with the Scottish Government and in partnership with the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And I'd also like to thank all of the landowners who helped provide us with data, which input into the financial modelling component and also into the biodiversity metric component as well. Yeah, so with that, I'll hand over to Renee to manage questions if we have any in the chat. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Rochelle. A really good oversight of what you've been doing over the last only 6 months, as you'd highlight this. This has all been done in 6 months. Yeah, so for those who don't know me, I'm Renee Kirkfleet-Hermans. I work for ISHN UK Peatland Programme, where I head up the Peatland Code team. So I'm going to fire off some questions that have already come through in the chat. Please keep them coming and I will do my best to answer them live, but otherwise we can try and answer them offline later. So first question, Rochelle, for woodlands, have you considered the mandatory biodiversity requirements of the underlying UK forestry standard as well as the requirements of the voluntary UK woodlands assurance standard?
Yes, quite a lot in that question. So we're trying to align with standards as much as we possibly can, so government standards, and yeah, just trying to align as much as we can really with those. But yeah, we can look into more detail on those specific standards.
Right,
yeah,
Nat,
I think Nat might have something to.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in quickly. Hi, I'm Natalie from the Woodland Carbon Code team. I've been supporting Rochelle on this project for the past year. I just wanted to sort of flag gas. So obviously it's a mandatory requirement for projects to adhere to the UKFS under the Woodland Carbon Code already. So there's already that expectation that you are aligning with UKFS, which obviously lays out sort of how to manage your woodland best for biodiversity. And so what we're looking at doing is not necessarily providing guidance on how to manage your woodland for biodiversity, but just a methodology for how to quantify that. So yeah, I think that they're quite complementary, and this is going to be sort of a voluntary thing that people can do to measure the biodiversity uplift on their sites, which should be there if you're managing with UKFS compliance. Thanks, Rochelle. Sorry.
Great, thank you for that, Nat. So next question. So I think this is like, these came in when you were talking about the reference sites, and I think some of it you might have already answered, but it's still good to just get a definite answer on. So the question was if most of the impact peatlands looked at are geographically restricted. So is there a risk of not taking into account rare species or peatland habitat types which are found in parts of the country which were unsampled? So has that been accounted for? So for example, the West Coast is very different from the East Coast, and how would you deal with that?
Yeah, so it's a really good point. And yeah, obviously our database has highlighted that our data is geographically restricted. And so I think what we would do is, for projects where there is data available nearby, they could use that database. But it really that data would only be suitable for that geographic area. Yeah, so data that's been collected in the float country wouldn't be applicable to a project further south. So yeah, we can only really use it for projects that are in the same area. And so projects that are in a different area would probably have to use the method that does not use reference sites. So the weighting by specialist species. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you. An easy one. So just to double check the differential range value of the break-even price, they just wanted to double check is the additional value per credit unit needed to break even on carbon plus biodiversity versus carbon only.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so it's that difference between the break-even price in the carbon plus and the carbon only. There will be, so in the final financial report that's going to go up on the websites, there will be the actual break-even price, but we just didn't want to put those in when the financial modelling wasn't quite finished, but the actual break-even price will be available as well.
Right, thank you. And the question, how a country biodiversity strategy priority habitats and species considered? So based upon the original UK BAP lists, I think they were included one day.
Sorry, what was that? I missed the start of the question.
Oh, sorry. How were country biodiversity strategy priority habitats and species considered?
Yeah, so in the original Wallacea Trust method, where species are weighted for by conservation value, they would be considered using that method. Using the similarity index method or weighting by specialist species, we still need to figure out how any loss of those priority species would need to be accounted for. I mean, I think there are regulations that prevent woodland creation, for example, on semi-natural grasslands. So hopefully most of the peatland restoration or woodland creation is going to be taking place in quite intensive agricultural areas. So hopefully it won't be too much of a problem, but that is something that we need to iron out. Yeah, so I'm glad you raised that. Thanks.
Great. There was a question on if there's any plans on including data and sites from Northern Ireland as well. So obviously currently not included in your...
Yeah, no, that would be good. The database is definitely something that we need to build on. There is a little bit of data that I have actually from Northern Ireland for peatlands, but just didn't get a chance to add that to the database with the short time frames. There's a little bit for Northern Ireland, but it is, that was definitely a gap in the database.
Okay, thank you. In terms of integration, someone wants to just double check if it still would be voluntary. So can project developers make the choice to just run our carbon, like not measure their biodiversity and do still the implicit bundle, or will they have to do this carbon plus explicit bundle approach?
Yeah, so absolutely, it will be voluntary. The projects have to measure biodiversity and do this carbon plus approach. You can continue to just do your carbon only. That would be absolutely fine. Yeah.
Great. There's a question around the piloting for our project. So if we know how long we will be carrying out the pilot projects for. So for example, will you be measuring the baseline and then projecting, modeling, expected biodiversity uplift across each year? Or will you be measuring actual biodiversity uplift over a few years?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting one. I did have some chats with academics on the possibility of projecting biodiversity increase. At the moment, that would be quite difficult, I think, because we just don't know how biodiversity would change. We don't know. I mean, we have some kind of inkling, but it's not really good enough to actually project that biodiversity increase. So we don't know if there likely would be, a rapid increase at the start of a project, and then that might taper off, or if it might be more linear. Chances are it's unlikely to be linear, but I think we just don't know enough to be able to do that. So yes, basically projects would measure their biodiversity at baseline, and then they would measure it again in like 5 years' time, and then every 5 or 10 years after that, rather than actually trying to predict biodiversity increase.
Thank you. This one, I don't think you're going to be able to answer yet, but I'm going to ask it of you anyway. So there's a question on if projects will be allowed to sell these biodiversity credits up front, or if they will also ex ante, or if they will only be able to sell them once they are verified, so ex post, or both would be an option.
Yeah, so it's something that we have been discussing, isn't it? But yeah, we haven't made a final decision on that. I think at the moment we may be leaning towards only selling on verification, just because of the difficulties of actually predicting what that biodiversity increase might be. But yeah, it's undecided at the moment. So it's one of the things that we just need to iron out a little bit in the next stages of the project.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because it's a carbon plus a biodiversity uplift, so actually knowing exactly what the uplift might not be that important at the start when you settle it as an ex ante, because you might want to still sell your biodiversity credit as ex ante. So, but like Rochelle said, that's still up for, we're heavily discussing that at the moment, how that will work. Then a question that I'm going to ask, and I will probably just direct people to what's already on our website, because there's a question on how we settled upon the Wallacea Trust methodology as opposed to any of the other metrics out there. So that was actually done before Rochelle was in post. So that was done during our earlier project on the Ferns 1 that Joe Henderson led on. And that's all on the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code website, is why that methodology was chosen. So I can drop a link to that in the chat in a little bit. But yeah, I would urge you to just go and look at that for now. I don't know, Rochelle, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, you can see, I think you can see the whole scoring system that was done for all of the different methods, and yeah, how they were scored, and exactly why we ended up going with the Wallacea Trust method. So it would be useful to look at the information on the websites.
Then there's a question on if there's any scope to include historical projects if relevant reference data becomes available in the future, or will this only apply to newer projects registered after the method has been finalized?
So is this for projects that are already sort of partway through their journey and then wanting to kind of backdate?
That's yes.
Yeah. not entirely sure on that one. I think we've talked about projects that are partway through their journey and then starting the baselining, you know, like now, and that would be okay. But I'm not sure about backdating projects. I think as a discussion we probably need to have.
Yeah, indeed, there's still a few things to work out. Backdating is probably more difficult, but we have discussed in the project that you could measure your baseline at kind of where you are. So even if you have already done some work, a lot of these processes probably change quite slow. So if you're still quite early in your project, it's still probably useful to do that. Linked to that, but slightly different, but also on timescales, is a question around peatland vegetation. So especially peatland structure, assessing Richard Lindsay's condition matrix, it often changes in decadal timescales or even longer. So will that have a negative impact on the financial implication for peatlands under the code?
So in terms of its effect on the biodiversity uplift. Yeah. So at the moment, we don't know how much that biodiversity uplift is going to impact the price of the credit. So it's kind of hard to say. You know, we don't know if projects that are able to demonstrate a higher uplift are going to be able to sell their credits more or not. So hopefully that sort of thing will become clear when we have a better idea of actually how much impact that percentage uplift is going to have on the price of the credit.
Yeah, and because it's a basket of metrics, like you could see uplift through the other ones potentially quicker than on the structural of a peatland.
Yeah, that's true.
So you still get benefit from that.
Yeah, definitely, because it's an average score across multiple metrics. Scoring a low score on one metric doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to bring the score down, the overall score down by too much.
Yeah. Then there's a question on bundling. So a lot of existing credits are marketed as implicit bundles at the moment. By moving some projects to an explicit bundle, is there a risk that the value of existing implicit bundle credits would be less valuable in comparison to new explicit bundled credits?
Hopefully not. Again, if we can do some investor engagement and willingness to pay research, that is one of the questions that we'd like to have answered, because I know it's something that projects are concerned about. So yeah, whether kind of providing this carbon plus credit would then reduce the value of the carbon credit is something that we'd really like to know in the next part of the project. So we'll hopefully be able to tell you that in the not too distant future.
There's a lot of questions and debate in the chat going on about the willingness to pay and the cost of all of this work. I can see Nat of someone has just replied to some of that as well. But just ask, like, I think a lot of it has been discussed there, so I'm not going to repeat all of those questions. But I think one that is important to raise is the question on what kind of assumptions were used in the financial model. So did we include the projects, like all the additional layers as like validation, verification, on top of the actual monotone cost? Was all of that included in there or not?
Yeah, so that was all included. Yeah, all the possible costs, I think, associated with peatland restoration, woodland creation. And also just to say, I think Ricardo took quite a conservative approach as well. So we did tend more towards overestimating these costs rather than underestimating them. All of that detail will be in the final report, I think. So you'll be able to see the details of what went into the model.
Yeah, and then there was also a question on the carbon price, like the break-even price for carbon only projects, and if that was done as well. And I think just to also highlight what there's also the incomes in the model there, Michelle, that you could maybe touch on as well, how the model works. So it's not just, it's the funding as well as the carbon.
Yeah, so yeah, Ricardo did include things like income from grants or income from commercial forestry plantations. So that was included as well into the break-even price.
Yeah, so I can see there's a lot of interest in this financial modeling. So as soon as that, like, it should be on our website very soon. So I would urge everyone to have a look at the assumptions in there as well. And any feedback afterwards, would always be very welcome. Right, I've got a few more questions still. They're still coming, which is great.
Go for it.
There's a question on if we've looked at the timescales for achieving biodiversity gain. So for woodland side, couldn't it be hundreds of years to get specialist woodland species? And will that change over time as well?
Yes, so for woodlands, we know quite a bit about when those specialist species arrive. It would take hundreds of years to get the same kinds of specialists as you get in ancient woodland. But I think we're not suggesting that projects need to achieve those communities that are found in ancient woodlands. So I don't think I mentioned this, but the Wallacea Trust method kind of outlines that the reference site can be a previously restored or planted reference site of a similar age to the project. So if the project is going to be going for 60 years, then the reference site can be a woodland that was planted 60 years ago. And if those projects were comparing to more kind of near natural habitat, we have looked at trying to add like some kind of correction factor so they wouldn't have to achieve that like 100% like similarity with the kind of near natural reference site. For peatlands, it's a little bit more tricky because we just don't have the long-term monitoring data sets that we have for woodland. So I think with peatlands, we probably don't really know how long it's going to take for those more specialist species to move in.
Right, yeah. Well, hopefully you would see at least an increase, and that is
Yeah.
then quantified and therefore credited.
Yeah.
Right, I've got 2 more questions for you. I think then we are getting to the end of the webinar. So what's the current thinking on how the biodiversity benefits would be validated? So for example, would this be incorporated into the same documentation submitted for Woodland Code, the Woodland Carbon Code projects at like validation and verification and considered by one validator, or will there be parallel or additional processes for this?
Yeah, so it's one of the things that I think we need to iron out in the next part of the project. So we have been looking at other validators that could validate the biodiversity component, but also the ones that we already have, I think would be able to validate the biodiversity component alongside the carbon components. It will come at an extra cost, obviously. But I think the idea at the moment is that they would be done at the same time or the same sort of time as the carbon validation and verification.
Right, and then the last question is also a really nice one to actually end on, because there's a question on what is your estimated timescale for rolling this out for full use on projects?
Well, I guess it would be really nice to be able to roll it out at the end of the next phase, but it does kind of depend on getting the go-ahead from the executive boards. But I think that the roadmap that we put together, all these next steps that we put together, should bring us very close to actually being able to roll this out. So, yeah, within the next year, hopefully, but there could always be delays to that.
Right, thank you very much. I think that was all the questions that have gone into the chat. So Susan, back to you, please.
Great, thanks Renee, thanks Rochelle. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We'd really value your feedback on today's session. I'm just going to share a very quick poll in the chat. Hopefully has that worked for you? It should be launching now, there we go. Yes, so yeah, thank you very much for attending. Thanks to Rochelle and Renee and Nat for all their help with the questions and answers and the presentation. So as we mentioned at the start, this session is being recorded, so we'll make the recording available through our websites and our newsletters as soon as we can after the event. So that's it for today. Thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks for all your excellent questions and discussions. Take care now. Thank you. Bye-bye.